The fluorescent lights of the House Oversight Committee hearing room blazed down on the polished wooden tables. The air was thick with tension as Speaker of the House Mike Johnson gripped his gavel, his knuckles white with barely contained anger. Across from him sat Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas, her expression calm but her eyes sharp as knives. Johnson had just spent the last 3 minutes tearing into Crockett's latest proposal on police reform, his voice rising with each accusation. The cameras were rolling. C-SPAN was broadcasting live to millions. Every major news network had their eyes glued to this moment. Representative Crockett, Johnson's voice echoed through the chamber, dripping with condescension. Your reckless proposals are nothing more than political theater designed to undermine law enforcement across this nation. You don't care about public safety, you care about headlines. The room went silent. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Republican members nodded in approval. Democratic members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some whispering to their aides. This wasn't just a policy disagreement anymore, this was personal, this was an attack. Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly still, one hand resting on the table in front of her, the other holding her pen. She didn't flinch, she didn't look away. She simply waited for Johnson to finish, a slight smile playing at the corner of her lips, as if she knew something he didn't. What happened in the next 30 seconds would not only end this hearing instantly but would explode across social media, dominate news cycles for days, and fundamentally shift the power dynamics in Congress. Johnson thought he was delivering a knockout blow. He had no idea he was walking straight into a trap set by one of the sharpest legal minds in the House. Before we dive into what happened next, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You don't want to miss a single moment of these political showdowns. Now, let's see how Jasmine Crockett turned Mike Johnson's attack into his worst nightmare. To understand why this confrontation mattered so much, you need to know exactly who these two political figures are and what they represent in American politics today. Mike Johnson, the conservative powerhouse Mike Johnson, didn't just stumble into the speaker's chair. The 51-year-old Louisiana congressman had spent years building his reputation as a constitutional lawyer and conservative Christian warrior. He grew up in Shreveport, Louisiana, was homeschooled, and built his early career defending religious liberty cases. He wasn't some career politician who switched positions with the wind. Johnson was a true believer. When he became Speaker in October 2023, it wasn't because he was the obvious choice, it was because the Republican Party was in chaos. After Kevin McCarthy's ouster, the party went through candidate after candidate. Jim Jordan couldn't get the votes, Steve Scalise withdrew, the party was eating itself alive on national television. Then came Mike Johnson, the compromise candidate who somehow united the warring factions. He was conservative enough for the Freedom Caucus, establishment enough for the moderates, and unknown enough that he didn't have a target on his back. Yet, Johnson's entire political identity was built on 3 pillars: traditional family values, constitutional originalism, and law and order. He had argued cases before the Supreme Court. He had written extensively about the Founding Fathers' original intent, and he had made it crystal clear that he believed America was sliding into moral decay, that progressive Democrats were destroying the country's foundations, and that only a return to conservative principles could save the nation. In his mind, people like Jasmine Crockett represented everything wrong with modern politics. Young, progressive, media-savvy politicians who cared more about viral moments than actual governance. He saw her police reform proposals as attacks on the men and women in blue who kept America safe. He saw her criminal justice reform advocacy as soft on crime. And he saw her rise to prominence as evidence that social media had corrupted serious legislative work. Johnson wasn't just disagreeing with Crockett on policy. He was trying to delegitimize her entirely, to paint her as an unserious politician playing to the cameras, and he thought this hearing was his opportunity to do exactly that in front of the entire nation. Jasmine Crockett, the rising star. If Mike Johnson represented the conservative establishment, Jasmine Crockett represented the new generation of progressive fighters who weren't playing by the old rules anymore. At 43, Crockett wasn't some wide-eyed newcomer who stumbled into Congress by accident. This was a woman who had been preparing for this moment her entire life. She grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, got her undergraduate degree from Mary Washington College, and then earned her law degree from the University of Houston Law Center. But unlike many lawyers who go into corporate law to make money, Crockett went into civil rights law to make a difference. She spent years as a public defender and civil rights attorney in Texas, representing people who couldn't afford fancy lawyers, fighting police brutality cases, and going toe-to-toe with prosecutors who had unlimited resources. She didn't just study the law in textbooks. She lived it in courtrooms, often as the only black woman in the room, facing judges and opposing counsel who underestimated her every single time. That experience taught her something crucial. When people underestimate you, you can use that to your advantage. Crockett first entered politics in the Texas House of Representatives in 2020, representing Dallas. Even there, she made waves. She wasn't afraid to call out hypocrisy, to challenge senior members, or to use her legal expertise to dissect bad legislation on the floor. Her speeches went viral. Her cross-examinations of witnesses became legendary in Texas political circles. She was sharp, she was prepared, and she was fearless. When she ran for Congress in 2022, she won decisively in Texas's 30th district. And when she arrived in Washington, she didn't come to make friends. She came to fight. Crockett quickly became known for her work on the House Oversight Committee, where she grilled witnesses with the precision of a seasoned trial attorney. She didn't grandstand. She didn't waste time with long speeches. She asked short, devastating questions that trapped witnesses into admitting things they didn't want to admit. She was methodical, relentless, and incredibly effective. Her police reform proposals weren't random ideas thrown together for headlines. They were carefully researched, data-driven policies designed to address specific problems: qualified immunity that protected bad cops, lack of accountability in police departments, and systemic racism in law enforcement. She had the statistics memorized, she had the case law ready, and she had personal stories from her clients that humanized the issue. But what really set Crockett apart was her ability to communicate complex legal and policy issues in ways that regular people could understand. She didn't talk like a typical politician, using 50 words when 5 would do. She talked like a real person, with passion and clarity. Her social media presence was massive, with millions of followers who saw her as a truth teller in a city full of liars. The stakes? More than just a policy debate. This confrontation between Johnson and Crockett wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was taking place against the backdrop of massive national debates about race, justice, and power in America. Police reform had become one of the most divisive issues in the country. After the murder of George Floyd and the protests that followed, Democrats pushed for major changes, ending qualified immunity, banning chokeholds, creating national databases to track bad cops. Republicans pushed back hard, arguing that these reforms would handcuff police officers and make communities less safe. Mike Johnson represented the Republican position perfectly. He believed that the overwhelming majority of police officers were heroes who risked their lives every day, and that a few bad apples shouldn't result in wholesale changes that would endanger public safety. He thought Democrats were demonizing law enforcement for political gain. Jasmine Crockett represented the progressive position just as clearly. She believed that without accountability, bad cops would continue to get away with brutality and murder, and that communities of color would continue to live in fear of the people who were supposed to protect them. She thought Republicans were protecting a broken system because it served their political interests. This hearing was supposed to be about Crockett's latest bill, the Law Enforcement Accountability Act. It had common-sense provisions, requiring body cameras, creating independent review boards for police shootings, and limiting qualified immunity in cases of obvious misconduct. But Johnson had turned it into a referendum on whether Crockett herself was fit to legislate on these issues. The gallery was packed. Criminal justice advocates sat on one side, police union representatives on the other. The media section was overflowing with reporters from CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and every major newspaper. Twitter was already buzzing with the hashtag number Johnson vs. Crockett trending nationally. Everyone sensed that something big was about to happen. The tension in the room was electric, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Mike Johnson had thrown down the gauntlet. Now everyone was waiting to see how Jasmine Crockett would respond. Would she back down? Would she get defensive? Would she lose her cool? Johnson was betting she would do at least one of those things. He had seen young, progressive politicians get flustered under pressure before. He had watched them make mistakes when attacked personally. He thought this would be no different. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. The moment Mike Johnson finished his opening attack on Jasmine Crockett, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. His words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Your reckless proposals are nothing more than political theater designed to undermine law enforcement across this nation. You don't care about public safety. You care about headlines. Johnson sat back in his chair, a satisfied look on his face. He had landed what he thought was a devastating blow. He glanced at his Republican colleagues, several of whom were nodding in approval. Representative Jim Jordan of Ohio gave him a subtle thumbs up. Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene was smiling broadly, already pulling out her phone to tweet about the moment. But something was off. The Democrats weren't reacting the way Johnson expected. They weren't jumping to Crockett's defense. They weren't calling for points of order. They weren't making angry faces. Instead, they were watching Crockett with expressions that looked almost like anticipation. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York was leaning back in her chair with her arms crossed, a slight smile on her face. Representative Jamie Raskin of Maryland was adjusting his glasses, looking like he was settling in to watch a show he'd been waiting for. Jasmine Crockett remained perfectly still. She hadn't moved an inch during Johnson's attack. Her hands were folded neatly on the table in front of her. Her expression was neutral, almost serene. She let the silence stretch out for 5 full seconds, then 10, then 15. The discomfort in the room grew with each passing moment. Johnson's smile began to falter slightly. Why wasn't she responding? Why wasn't she defending herself? The silence was becoming awkward, painful even. Finally, Crockett slowly raised her hand, signaling that she wanted to speak. Johnson, now looking slightly uncertain, nodded at her. "Mr. Speaker," Crockett's voice was calm, measured, and carried clearly through the room. "I appreciate your passionate remarks about my legislation. But before I respond to your characterization of my work, I'd like to ask you a few questions. Is that acceptable under the rules of this hearing?" Johnson blinked. This wasn't what he expected. He expected anger, defensiveness, maybe an impassioned speech about social justice. He didn't expect questions. Well, this is highly unusual, Representative Crockett. This is a hearing on your bill, not a cross-examination of the chair." "Oh, I understand that, Mr. Speaker," Crockett replied smoothly. "But you've made some serious allegations about my motivations and my character. I think the American people watching this deserve context. So I'm asking for just 2 minutes to ask you a few simple questions. Surely you're not afraid of answering questions from a member who you've just accused of not caring about public safety?" The trap was already being set, and Johnson was starting to sense it, but he was stuck. If he refused to answer questions after attacking her, he would look like a bully and a coward. If he agreed, he was walking into unknown territory. "Fine," he said curtly. 2 minutes. But make it quick." Crockett nodded. She pulled out a single sheet of paper from the folder in front of her. The camera zoomed in. What was on that paper? "Mr. Speaker, you've been in Congress since 2017, correct?" "Yes, that's correct." "And you represent Louisiana's 4th Congressional District?" "Everyone here knows that, Representative Crockett. What's your point?" "I'm getting there, Mr. Speaker, just establishing some basic facts. Now, Louisiana has one of the highest incarceration rates in the entire world, not just in America, in the world. Are you aware of that statistic?" Johnson shifted in his seat. "Louisiana has high crime rates. We believe in consequences for criminal behavior." "I see. And in your district specifically, there have been multiple lawsuits against local police departments for excessive force, haven't there? In fact, the Shreveport Police Department settled 3 major civil rights lawsuits in the last 5 years alone. Are you aware of those cases?" Johnson's face was starting to redden. "I don't have those specific numbers in front of me, but isolated incidents don't represent isolated?" Crockett's voice rose slightly, her first show of emotion. "Mr. Speaker, I have the documentation right here. The city of Shreveport paid out over $2.5 million in settlements for police misconduct cases. That's taxpayer money, Mr. Speaker. Money that could have gone to schools, infrastructure, or actual public safety measures. But instead, it went to compensate people who were beaten, tased without justification, or had their civil rights violated by officers who faced no criminal consequences." The room was no longer silent. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Reporters were typing furiously on their laptops. The Democratic members were leaning forward, engaged now. The Republican members were looking uncomfortable, some whispering to their aides. Johnson tried to regain control. "Representative Crockett, I don't appreciate you attacking my hometown." "I'm not attacking your hometown, Mr. Speaker." Crockett cut him off, her voice sharp as a scalpel. "I'm providing context. You accused me of not caring about public safety. But I've spent the last decade as a civil rights attorney representing people whose safety was violated by the very officers you're claiming I want to undermine. I've seen the autopsy photos. I've read the medical reports. I've held the hands of mothers who buried their sons because of police violence." She paused, letting that sink in, then continued. "Now, Mr. Speaker, let me ask you something else. Have you read my bill? The actual text of the Law Enforcement Accountability Act?" Johnson hesitated. It was just for a split second, but everyone in the room saw it. "I've been briefed on it by my staff, so that's a no. You haven't read it yourself." You just accused me of reckless political theater, but you haven't actually read the legislation you're attacking. Is that correct? I have read the summary, not the actual bill. Mr. Speaker, this is a 37-page bill with specific provisions, data citations, and implementation guidelines. But you read a summary and decided that was enough to publicly question my commitment to public safety? Johnson was visibly flustered now. His face was red, his jaw was clenched, and his hands were gripping the gavel so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Representative Crockett, your time for questions is up. This hearing is about your bill, not about my district or my reading habits. Oh, I disagree, Mr. Speaker, Crockett shot back, her voice like ice. This hearing stopped being about my bill the moment you made it personal. You attacked my character and my motivations in front of the entire country. So now we're going to talk about qualifications and credibility. She stood up, and every eye in the room followed her movement. This was a power move, a visual assertion of dominance. In courtrooms, standing while your opponent sits is a way of claiming the psychological high ground. Crockett knew exactly what she was doing. Let me tell you what's in my bill, Mr. Speaker, since you couldn't be bothered to read it yourself. It requires body cameras to be on during all police encounters with the public. That's it for Section 1. Just cameras. Are you opposed to cameras, Mr. Speaker? Are cameras reckless political theater that undermines law enforcement? Johnson didn't answer. He knew anything he said now would make things worse. Section 2 creates civilian review boards for officer-involved shootings with subpoena power to review evidence independently. You know why that's necessary, Mr. Speaker? Because in case after case, we've seen police departments investigate themselves and find no wrongdoing, even when the evidence clearly shows misconduct. Are you saying that independent review is somehow anti-police? She was on a roll now, her voice getting stronger with each sentence. The Democratic side of the room was energized. AOC was nodding vigorously, Raskin was writing notes. Even some of the more moderate Democrats who usually stayed quiet during confrontational moments were sitting up straighter. Section 3 deals with qualified immunity, but only in cases of obvious and egregious misconduct. I'm not talking about split-second decisions in dangerous situations. I'm talking about officers who plant evidence, who falsify reports, who use excessive force on handcuffed suspects. Should those officers be protected from civil liability, Mr. Speaker? Johnson finally found his voice. You're twisting my words, Representative Crockett. I never said. No, Mr. Speaker, you didn't say anything substantive. You just attacked me personally and hoped that would be enough. But it's not enough. Not today. Not anymore. The room was crackling with energy now. Even the C-SPAN cameras seemed to be capturing something electric, something real. This wasn't the usual scripted political theater. This was genuine confrontation, and everyone watching knew they were witnessing something significant. Representative Jim Jordan tried to jump in. Mr. Speaker, point of order. Representative Crockett is out of line. Crockett whirled on him. Out of line? Out of line? Was the Speaker in line when he questioned my commitment to public safety? Was he in line when he accused me of only caring about headlines? Or is it only out of line when I defend myself with actual facts and evidence? Jordan sat back down, looking like he regretted speaking up. Johnson banged his gavel, but it sounded weak, ineffectual. Representative Crockett, you will address the chair with respect. I have shown you nothing but respect, Mr. Speaker, which is more than you showed me. I addressed you properly. I asked permission to speak. I followed every rule of decorum. What I will not do is sit silently while you impugn my character based on legislation you admittedly haven't even read. The tension in the room was at a breaking point. Republicans were shouting for order. Democrats were cheering. The gallery was in chaos, with some people standing to get a better view, others holding up their phones to record. Security guards by the doors were on high alert, ready to intervene if things got physical, though of course they wouldn't. This was a different kind of fight, a battle of words and wills that was somehow more intense than any physical confrontation could be. Mike Johnson knew he had lost control of the hearing. This was his worst nightmare, being outmaneuvered, out-argued, and humiliated in front of the entire nation by a member he had tried to belittle. He could see his staff in the back of the room making frantic hand signals, probably trying to figure out how to salvage this disaster, but Jasmine Crockett wasn't done yet. She had one more move to make, one final blow that would end this hearing instantly and cement this moment in congressional history. She looked directly at Mike Johnson, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet but carried to every corner of the room. Mr. Speaker, I have one final question for you, and then I'll yield my time. It's a simple question, and it requires only a yes or no answer. Johnson looked like a trapped animal, but he nodded stiffly. Have you ever in your entire legal and political career represented a single person who was a victim of police brutality? Just yes or no. Silence. Johnson's mouth opened, then closed. He looked at his colleagues for support, but they were staring at their desks, at the ceiling, anywhere but at him. They knew what was coming. Mr. Speaker, yes or no? That's not a relevant question too. It's completely relevant. You question my commitment to public safety. I'm questioning your experience with police accountability. So I'll ask again. Have you ever represented a victim of police brutality? No, but, thank you, Mr. Speaker, that's all I needed to hear. And then Jasmine Crockett delivered her knockout punch. The entire hearing room seemed to freeze in that moment. Mike Johnson had just admitted, on national television, that he had never once represented a victim of police brutality despite attacking Jasmine Crockett for her work on police reform. The irony was devastating. But Crockett wasn't content with just that admission. She had been building to this moment, and now she was going to deliver her closing statement with surgical precision. She picked up her folder, pulled out several more documents, and laid them on the table in front of her with deliberate care. Each movement was calculated, designed to build anticipation. The camera zoomed in on the documents, though the text wasn't quite legible on screen. Mr. Speaker, she began, her voice now carrying a quiet authority that commanded absolute attention. You've never represented a victim of police brutality, but I have. Let me tell you about just 3 of my clients, and then I'll explain why your attack on me today was not just wrong but dangerous. Johnson moved to interrupt, but Crockett held up one hand. I'm not asking for permission, Mr. Speaker. I'm exercising my right as a member of this committee to make a statement for the record. You'll have your chance to respond when I'm done, just as you had your chance to attack me without warning. Johnson sat back, his face a mixture of anger and resignation. He knew he couldn't stop her now without looking like an authoritarian bully. Client number 1, Crockett continued, holding up the first document. Marcus Williams, age 19, pulled over for a broken taillight in Dallas, Texas. When he reached for his registration as instructed by the officer, he was tased 3 times, dragged from his car, and beaten so severely he spent 4 days in the hospital with a fractured skull and broken ribs. He was charged with resisting arrest. I represented Marcus pro bono because his family couldn't afford a lawyer. She paused, letting the details sink in. We went through the officer's body camera footage, frame by frame. You know what we found? Marcus never resisted, not once. He was polite, he kept his hands visible, he did everything right. But the officer's report claimed Marcus attacked him. It was a complete fabrication. We took that case to trial, and a jury awarded Marcus $1.2 million in damages. But that officer? He's still on the force, Mr. Speaker. Still pulling people over. Still filing reports. The gallery was completely silent now. Even the reporters had stopped typing, transfixed by Crockett's testimony. Client number 2. She held up the second document. Brianna Jefferson, age 24, mother of 2. Police responded to a domestic disturbance call at her apartment. Her boyfriend had been violent, and a neighbor called 911. When officers arrived, Brianna was the one who answered the door. She tried to explain the situation, but the officers immediately became aggressive. They slammed her against the wall, handcuffed her so tightly she had nerve damage in her wrists for months, and arrested her for obstruction of justice. Meanwhile, her boyfriend, the actual abuser, walked out the back door and wasn't caught for 3 weeks. Crockett's voice remained steady, but there was emotion underneath. Carefully controlled but unmistakable. I represented Brianna when she was fired from her job because of that arrest, even though the charges were later dropped. We sued the police department for unlawful arrest and excessive force. We won. The city settled for $850,000. But those officers? Still working. Still responding to domestic violence calls. Still treating victims like criminals. She could see that some members of the committee were visibly moved. Representative Cori Bush of Missouri, herself a former activist who had experienced police violence, had tears in her eyes. Even some Republicans were looking uncomfortable, shifting in their seats. Client number 3. Crockett held up the final document, and her voice dropped lower, heavier. Terrence Matthews, age 17. He's not my client anymore, Mr. Speaker. Because Terrence is dead. The room seemed to contract, the air growing heavier. Terrence was walking home from a friend's house at 9 p.m. on a Saturday night. He had his headphones in, listening to music. A police officer saw him, thought he matched the description of a suspect in a robbery, and confronted him. Terrence, who couldn't hear the officer because of his headphones, kept walking. The officer interpreted this as fleeing. He tackled Terrence from behind, slammed him face first into the pavement, and put his knee on Terrence's neck for 8 minutes while backup arrived. Crockett's hands were shaking slightly now, but her voice remained strong. By the time the backup officers realized something was wrong and pulled their colleague off, Terrence wasn't breathing. EMTs couldn't revive him. He died right there on the sidewalk, 3 blocks from his house, where his mother was waiting for him to come home. I represented his family in the wrongful death lawsuit. We had video from a nearby security camera that showed everything. Terrence never resisted, he never fought back. He just wanted to go home. She looked directly at Mike Johnson, and her next words cut through the silence like a blade. That officer claimed he feared for his life from a 17-year-old boy with headphones. And you know what happened to him, Mr. Speaker? 30 days of paid suspension, that's it. He's back on the streets right now. And Terrence's mother buried her son 3 years ago this month. Several people in the gallery were openly crying now. The weight of Crockett's words had transformed the room from a political battlefield into something more like a memorial service. So when you stand there, Crockett continued, her voice rising now, and accuse me of not caring about public safety, when you say my work is just political theater, when you question my motivations, you're not just attacking me, Mr. Speaker. You're disrespecting Marcus, and Brianna, and Terrence, and the hundreds of other people I've represented who were failed by a system that desperately needs reform. She picked up her bill, held it up for the cameras. This legislation isn't political theater, it's a roadmap to accountability. It's an attempt to create systems that prevent what happened to my clients from happening to someone else's clients. And the fact that you attacked it without even reading it tells me everything I need to know about your priorities. Johnson tried to speak. Representative Crockett, I'm not finished, Mr. Speaker. The boldness of that interruption sent shockwaves through the room. You simply did not interrupt the Speaker of the House. But Crockett had gone beyond normal protocol. This wasn't about decorum anymore, this was about truth. You called my proposals reckless. Let me tell you what's actually reckless, Mr. Speaker. It's reckless to defend a system that pays out billions of dollars in misconduct settlements every year instead of fixing the underlying problems. It's reckless to protect officers who violate civil rights instead of holding them accountable. It's reckless to attack police reform advocates while offering no solutions of your own. She leaned forward, hands on the table. You know what's in my bill that could have saved Terrence Matthews' life? Mandatory de-escalation training. Requirements for officers to identify themselves clearly before physical contact. Ban on dangerous restraint techniques. Independent investigations for in-custody deaths. These aren't radical ideas, Mr. Speaker. They're common-sense measures that police reform advocates, civil rights groups, and even some law enforcement organizations support. Crockett pulled out one more document, and this one made Johnson's face go pale. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I have here a letter from the Louisiana State Police Union from 2019, before you became Speaker, before police reform became a partisan flashpoint. Would you like to know what they said? She didn't wait for an answer. They called for body cameras, independent review processes, and better training standards. The exact things you just called reckless political theater. So either Louisiana's police union was engaging in political theater against themselves, or you're willing to abandon positions that law enforcement actually supports just to score political points against Democrats. The trap had been sprung completely. Johnson had nowhere to go. Every defense he could mount had been preemptively destroyed. If he backed down, he looked weak. If he doubled down, he looked heartless and hypocritical. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez couldn't contain herself. Point of order, Mr. Speaker. Johnson, grateful for any interruption, quickly recognized her. The chair recognizes Representative Ocasio-Cortez. AOC stood, and there was fire in her eyes. Mr. Speaker, I move that we vote to advance Representative Crockett's Law Enforcement Accountability Act to the full House for consideration. We've heard enough testimony today about the necessity and the moral imperative of this legislation. The room erupted. Democrats jumped to their feet, applauding. Republicans shouted in protest. Johnson banged his gavel repeatedly, but the chaos couldn't be contained. Order, order, Johnson shouted, his voice cracking slightly. We have not completed the testimony phase. We have witnesses scheduled to, with all due respect, Mr. Speaker. Representative Jamie Raskin stood now, his voice calm but firm. You transformed this hearing from a policy discussion into a personal attack on Representative Crockett. She has responded by demonstrating not only her expertise but the moral foundation of her work. What more testimony do we need? Let's vote. More Democrats stood. Vote, vote, vote. They began chanting. The Republicans were in disarray. Some were shouting for order, others were huddling in small groups trying to figure out what to do. This was unprecedented. Hearings didn't just turn into impromptu votes because of dramatic speeches, but the momentum was entirely with Crockett and the Democrats. The C-SPAN footage was already being clipped and shared across social media. Crockett Speaks was trending on Twitter. News alerts were going out across the country. This wasn't just a congressional hearing anymore, this was a cultural moment. Mike Johnson knew he had to regain control somehow, but he had no good options. If he refused to allow a vote, he would look like he was afraid of democracy. If he allowed the vote right now, while emotions were running high and Democrats were energized, the bill might actually get enough moderate Republican votes to pass. He made his decision. The House will stand in recess for 30 minutes, Johnson announced, banging his gavel hard. We will reconvene to discuss the proper procedures for parliamentary inquiry, Mr. Speaker. Representative Crockett called out, still standing. Johnson closed his eyes briefly, knowing this couldn't be good. The chair recognizes Representative Crockett for a parliamentary inquiry. Is it the chair's position that we should delay a vote on legislation that could save lives in order to protect political sensibilities? It was a rhetorical trap, and everyone knew it. Any answer Johnson gave would sound bad. If he said yes, he was admitting he prioritized politics over lives. If he said no, he had to explain why he was calling a recess. That's not a parliamentary inquiry, Representative Crockett. That's a political statement. Then let me rephrase, Mr. Speaker. Under House rules, if a motion to advance legislation is made and seconded during a committee hearing, does the chair have the authority to indefinitely delay consideration of that motion? Johnson's chief of staff was frantically shaking his head in the background. This was getting into technical parliamentary procedure, and if Johnson misstepped here, it could create a precedent disaster. The motion was not properly made according to, I'm happy to make it properly, AOC jumped in. I move, pursuant to House Rule D11, Clause 2, Paragraph A, that the Committee on Oversight and Accountability advance H.R. 3487, the Law Enforcement Accountability Act, to the full House with a favorable recommendation. Representative Raskin stood immediately. I second the motion. Now Johnson was truly stuck. A properly made motion, properly seconded during a committee session. By the rules, it had to be considered. But this was his committee, his hearing, his chance to kill this bill quietly without it ever reaching the House floor. The motion is out of order because we have not completed witness testimony. Johnson tried one last time, but Representative Crockett had one final card to play. Mr. Speaker, with respect, you cannot have it both ways. Either this is a proper committee hearing, in which case you should not have launched into a personal attack on a bill's sponsor without cause, or this has become a political demonstration, in which case the normal rules don't apply. Which is it? The room fell silent. Every eye was on Mike Johnson. The cameras were tight on his face, catching every micro-expression. Sweat was visible on his forehead. His jaw was clenched. His hands were white-knuckled on the gavel. He had walked into this hearing thinking he would embarrass a young progressive member and kill her police reform bill before it gained traction. Instead, he had been systematically dismantled by someone who was better prepared, more knowledgeable, and far more skilled at this kind of confrontation than he had anticipated. And now, trapped by his own actions and by parliamentary procedure, he had to make a choice that would define his speakership. The silence stretched out for 10 seconds, 15, 20. It felt like an eternity. Finally, Mike Johnson spoke, and his voice was tight with barely controlled anger. The committee stands in recess. Indefinitely. He banged the gavel one final time and stood up, walking quickly out of the hearing room without looking back. His staff scrambled to follow him, leaving the committee in chaos. But as Johnson disappeared through the doors, one sound followed him: applause. It started with the Democrats on the committee, then spread to the gallery, then grew into a standing ovation. They weren't applauding Johnson, they were applauding Jasmine Crockett. She stood there, still at the witness table, watching Johnson's retreat. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She simply gathered her documents, nodded to her colleagues, and walked out of the hearing room with her head held high. Representative Crockett had just done something that rarely happens in modern politics. She had won a confrontation so decisively that her opponent literally fled the room. But the real impact of this hearing was only beginning to unfold. Within minutes of Mike Johnson calling the indefinite recess and walking out, the internet exploded. The C-SPAN clip of Jasmine Crockett's 30-second reply, where she asked Johnson if he'd ever represented a victim of police brutality, was already going viral. But it wasn't just that moment. It was the entire sequence: Johnson's attack, Crockett's methodical dismantling of his credibility, her stories about Marcus, Brianna, and Terrence, and finally Johnson's retreat. Twitter erupted first. Within 5 minutes, number Crockett speaks was the number one trending topic in the United States. Within 10 minutes, it was trending globally. Black Lives Matter tweeted, "This is what accountability looks like." Representative Crockett didn't just defend her bill, she defended every victim of police brutality who never got their day in court. This is why representation matters. The tweet included a clip of Crockett telling Terrence Matthews' story and had already been retweeted over 50,000 times. Teen Vogue posted, "Gen Z queen at Jasmine for US just gave the most important speech on police reform we've ever heard. Mike Johnson walked into that hearing thinking he could intimidate her. He ran out looking like he'd seen a ghost." That's the power of knowing your facts and fighting for justice. Conservative commentators tried to spin the situation their way, but they were fighting an uphill battle. The optics were too clear. A powerful white male speaker had attacked a black woman member, and she had responded with facts, evidence, and moral clarity that left him with no response. Ben Shapiro tweeted, "Democrats are celebrating Johnson leaving a circus hearing as if it's a victory. It's not. It's a sign that House proceedings have devolved into performance art." But even his replies were filled with people pushing back. Maybe if Johnson had read the bill before attacking it, he wouldn't have been embarrassed, wrote one user with thousands of likes. Fox News was in damage control mode. Their initial coverage tried to frame the incident as contentious hearing and partisan disagreement, but even their own hosts were struggling. When asked about the confrontation on the 5, Greg Gutfeld said, "Look, I'm not going to defend Johnson on this one. If you're going to come at someone that hard, you better have your facts straight." He clearly didn't. CNN, MSNBC, and the mainstream media were running wall-to-wall coverage. Jake Tapper on CNN, "This is one of the most striking moments we've seen in Congress in years." Representative Crockett didn't just defend her legislation. She put a human face on the issue of police reform in a way that I think will resonate far beyond this hearing room. Rachel Maddow on MSNBC devoted her entire opening segment to the confrontation. Mike Johnson thought he could score easy political points by attacking Jasmine Crockett, but he made a fundamental miscalculation. He treated her like a typical politician who would get defensive and emotional. Instead, he faced a trained civil rights attorney who came prepared with evidence, personal experience, and a moral clarity that he simply could not match. But the real explosion was happening on TikTok and Instagram, where younger viewers were discovering the confrontation. Content creators were breaking down the exchange, explaining the significance, and adding their own commentary. One TikTok with 3 million views in the first hour showed side-by-side screens. Johnson's confident smirk at the beginning of the hearing versus his pale, tight-lipped expression as he called the recess. The caption, "When you underestimate a black woman, and she ends your whole career in 30 seconds. Another viral video compiled Crockett's most powerful quotes from the hearing set to dramatic music. "You've never represented a victim of police brutality, Marcus Williams, Breonna Jefferson, Terrence Matthews. You're disrespecting their memory. This isn't political theater. It's a roadmap to accountability." The video ended with Johnson walking out of the hearing room and the text, "And he was never heard from again." College campuses erupted with celebrations. At Howard University, Crockett's alma mater, students organized a spontaneous rally where they played the hearing video on big screens and chanted, "That's our lawyer." At the University of Texas, where Crockett got her law degree, the Black Law Students Association released a statement. Representative Crockett demonstrated today why representation matters and why diversity in the legal profession is essential. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the political implications were rapidly unfolding. In the Republican caucus meeting room, Mike Johnson faced a furious group of members who knew he had just handed Democrats a massive victory. "Mike, what the hell were you thinking?" Representative Kevin McCarthy, the former speaker, was the first to confront him. "You turned a routine committee hearing into a national referendum on police reform. And you lost." Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, surprisingly, was defending Johnson. He was right to call out her radical agenda. "We can't back down just because the liberal media—" "This isn't about the liberal media, Marjorie," Representative Don Bacon of Nebraska interrupted. "I'm already getting calls from police unions in my district asking why the speaker attacked their reform recommendations from 2019. Jasmine Crockett pulled out a letter from Louisiana State Police supporting body cameras and independent reviews. That's not radical. That's reasonable." Representative Chip Roy of Texas added, "And she's from Texas. My constituents are calling me asking why we're opposing legislation that could prevent lawsuits that cost taxpayers millions." She made the conservative argument for reform, and Mike handed her the platform to do it. Johnson sat at the head of the table, his face still flushed. She ambushed me. She had all of that prepared. Of course she did, McCarthy exploded. She's a trial lawyer, that's what they do. You never go into cross-examination unprepared, and you never ever attack someone's character unless you're absolutely certain they can't flip it back on you. You made a rookie mistake, Mike. The meeting dissolved into arguments about how to handle the fallout. Some members wanted to double down, to paint Crockett as an extremist who had disrespected the speaker. Others wanted to pivot, to distance themselves from Johnson's remarks, and try to work with moderates on some form of police reform that they could claim credit for, but the damage was done. Mike Johnson's authority as speaker had been undermined, not by a leadership challenge but by a single hearing where he lost control and lost face. Across the Capitol, the Democratic caucus was celebrating like they'd won a major election. Nancy Pelosi, the former speaker and still a powerful voice in the party, stood up when Jasmine Crockett entered the caucus room. The entire room rose with her, giving Crockett a standing ovation that lasted over a minute. When the room finally quieted, Pelosi approached Crockett and hugged her. "I've been in Congress for 36 years," she said loud enough for everyone to hear, "and I've never seen a more perfect example of preparation meeting opportunity. You were magnificent." Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, attended the meeting specifically to congratulate Crockett. "The Senate has been working on our own police reform bill, but it's been stalled. After today, I think we might finally have the momentum to get something passed. You changed the conversation." But the most interesting response came from Representative Hakeem Jeffries, the Democratic Minority Leader. He pulled Crockett aside after the caucus meeting. "Jasmine, what you did today was more than just good politics. You told a story that connected with people. You made the issue personal and real. That's something we've been trying to do for years, but we've been losing the messaging battle." He paused, then continued, "I want you to lead a task force on criminal justice reform. Not just police accountability but the whole system, sentencing reform, prison reform, re-entry programs. Use what happened today to build momentum for comprehensive change." Crockett nodded slowly. She knew what this meant. She was being elevated from a sophomore member known for viral moments to a serious legislative leader. It was an opportunity, but also a massive responsibility. "I'll do it," she said. "But I want real authority, not just a title. I want to be able to negotiate directly with moderate Republicans who might be open to reform." Jeffries smiled. Done. The civil rights community was equally energized. The NAACP released a statement within hours. Representative Crockett's testimony today reminded the nation that police reform isn't an abstract political debate. It's about real people who have been harmed by systems that lack accountability. "We call on Congress to pass the Law Enforcement Accountability Act immediately." The ACLU announced they would launch a national campaign around the bill, using clips from the hearing in their advocacy materials. Police reform advocacy groups saw donations surge. Color of Change reported that their website crashed from traffic as people tried to sign petitions supporting Crockett's legislation. Even some law enforcement voices spoke up in unexpected ways. The National Association of Black Law Enforcement Officers released a carefully worded statement. "While we have concerns about some aspects of proposed police reform legislation, we recognize that accountability measures are necessary to rebuild trust between law enforcement and the communities we serve. We appreciate Representative Crockett's focus on specific, data-driven solutions." It wasn't a full endorsement, but it was a crack in the wall of law enforcement opposition to reform. The legal community was buzzing as well. Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term intersectionality, tweeted, "This is why we need black women in positions of power." Crockett brought her lived experience as a civil rights attorney into a legislative space and completely reframed the debate. That's the power of diverse perspectives. Law schools were already planning to use the hearing in their trial advocacy classes as an example of effective witness examination and cross-examination techniques. But perhaps the most powerful impact was on ordinary people who saw themselves in the stories Crockett told. Marcus Williams, the man Crockett had represented after being beaten during a traffic stop, posted on Facebook, "I never thought anyone in Congress cared about what happened to me. Today, Representative Crockett made sure the whole country heard my story." That's what real representation looks like. Breonna Jefferson, the domestic violence victim who was arrested instead of protected, tweeted, crying watching this hearing, "Thank you at Jasmine for US for fighting for people like me who the system failed." And most movingly, Terrence Matthews' mother posted a video on Instagram. She was sitting in her living room, tears streaming down her face. "I just watched Representative Crockett tell my son's story in Congress," she said, her voice breaking. "For 3 years, I've been trying to get anyone to listen, to care that my baby was killed for no reason. Today, the whole country heard Terrence's name. Today, his life mattered to someone besides his family. Representative Crockett, thank you. Thank you for not forgetting him." The video was shared by every major activist account, every progressive organization, and millions of individual users. It humanized the issue in a way that no policy paper or political speech ever could. By the end of the day, the Law Enforcement Accountability Act had gone from a bill that few people outside of political circles knew about to a national cause célèbre. A Change.org petition to bring it to the House floor for a vote gained over 500,000 signatures in 24 hours. Mike Johnson, meanwhile, was in full retreat. His office released a statement late in the evening. Speaker Johnson believes strongly in supporting law enforcement while also ensuring accountability. Today's hearing became contentious, but the Speaker remains committed to finding bipartisan solutions to improve public safety for all Americans. It was a generic, face-saving statement that admitted nothing and promised nothing. Political analysts universally panned it as weak and ineffective. Conservative commentator Eric Erickson tweeted, "Johnson's statement is exactly the kind of mealy-mouthed nonsense that makes Republicans look weak. Either stand by your criticism of Crockett or apologize for being unprepared. This middle ground stuff helps no one." The political betting markets, which track things like speaker retention and party control of the House, all showed Johnson's position weakening. Some analysts were already speculating about whether he could survive as Speaker through the end of his term. More importantly, several moderate Republicans quietly reached out to Crockett's office. They didn't want to be named publicly, but they wanted to talk about police reform. They represented suburban districts where voters were more moderate on social issues, and they had seen the polling. Police reform, when framed around accountability rather than defunding, was actually popular. Representative Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania, co-chair of the Bipartisan Problem Solvers Caucus, issued a statement. "I look forward to working with Representative Crockett on criminal justice reform that both improves accountability and supports law enforcement." Today's hearing highlighted the need for substantive policy discussions rather than partisan attacks. It was a direct rebuke of Johnson from within his own party. The media coverage continued for days. Every major news program did segments on the confrontation. Political podcasts devoted entire episodes to analyzing what happened and what it meant for the future of police reform. The New York Times ran a profile of Crockett with the headline, "How a Civil Rights Lawyer Became Congress's Most Effective Communicator on Police Reform." The article detailed her background, her legal career, and how her courtroom experience prepared her for political combat. The Washington Post focused on the parliamentary and procedural aspects with the headline, "How Jasmine Crockett Used House Rules to Corner the Speaker." Political scientists were quoted explaining the technical brilliance of her tactical approach. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was on how police reform would be discussed going forward. Before this hearing, Republicans had successfully framed police reform as defund the police extremism that would make communities less safe. They had painted reform advocates as anti-police radicals who didn't care about law and order. Crockett's testimony reframed the entire debate. She talked about accountability, not punishment. She talked about protecting both communities and good officers from the damage bad officers cause. She talked about taxpayer money wasted on misconduct settlements. And she grounded everything in her personal experience representing real victims with real names and real stories. It was much harder for Republicans to dismiss that framing as radical or unreasonable. And the fact that she had evidence of police unions supporting similar reforms made it even more difficult to maintain the old talking points. Within a week, 3 Republican senators announced they would be introducing their own police reform bill that included several provisions similar to Crockett's, though watered down. They framed it as common-sense accountability measures and made no mention of Crockett or the hearing, but everyone knew what had happened. The confrontation between Johnson and Crockett had shifted the Overton window, the range of politically acceptable policy positions on police reform. Jasmine Crockett had done in one hearing what years of protests, policy papers, and political organizing hadn't fully accomplished. She had made police reform a mainstream, bipartisan issue that Republicans could no longer simply dismiss. And she had done it by being exactly who she was, a skilled attorney, a passionate advocate, and someone who refused to be intimidated by power. 2 weeks. After the hearing, Mike Johnson quietly removed himself from direct oversight of the Judiciary Committee's work on police reform. He claimed it was to focus on other priorities, but everyone understood it was a retreat. The Law Enforcement Accountability Act was scheduled for a full House vote. It wasn't guaranteed to pass, but it now had a real chance, something that seemed impossible before the hearing. Jasmine Crockett, for her part, continued her work with characteristic focus. She didn't do a victory tour or spend days on television gloating. She went back to her office, met with civil rights groups, negotiated with moderate Republicans, and refined her legislation. But she also did something else. She reached out personally to Marcus Williams, Breonna Jefferson, and Terrence Matthews' family. She thanked them for trusting her to tell their stories and promised them that their experiences would lead to meaningful change, because that's what this had all been about. Not political theater, not viral moments, not even embarrassing Mike Johnson, though that had certainly happened. It was about real people who had been failed by a broken system, and about fighting to fix that system so fewer people would be failed in the future. That's what made Jasmine Crockett's 30-second reply so powerful. It wasn't just a clever comeback or a devastating cross-examination, though it was both of those things. It was a reminder that at its best, politics is about using power to protect the powerless, about elevating voices that are usually silenced, and about fighting for justice even when the odds seem impossible. Mike Johnson had tried to paint Crockett as an unserious politician playing to the cameras. Instead, she showed the entire nation what serious, substantive, morally grounded politics looks like. And in doing so, she didn't just win a hearing, she changed the conversation. If you found this story compelling, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell. Political battles like this are happening every day in Congress, and you don't want to miss the moments when courage and preparation meet power and arrogance. Share this story with anyone who needs a reminder that change is possible, that speaking truth to power matters, and that sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys win. Thanks for reading, and I'll see you in the next story where we'll explore more moments when politicians underestimated their opponents and lived to regret it.